Hello, I'm Pika, and welcome back. Bloblobber is seen by players of all skill levels as a silly and rather annoying weapon to go up against. However, when you're the one using it, it can be both highly humorous and versatile. Blob is easily my most used weapon and favorite weapon in this game, and I'd like to share some of my knowledge on the weapon with the world. Since at the time of recording this, Splatoon 3 is on the horizon, and we haven't actually yet seen if Bloblobber is even in that game at all, or whether or not if it is, if it will have gone through some major changes. So because of that, there's no better time than now to explore and abuse this weapon while we still can. This video can be seen as a guide of sorts, as I'll be covering the general traits and strengths of the weapon, some of the ways it could be played most effectively, and overall why I find the weapon so strong and enjoyable. There's a lot to go through, so let's just get right into it. With most weapons in Splatoon, and as a general rule in most shooter games, you usually can't hit opponents without having line of sight on them. That means if a wall or other obstacle stands between you and your opponent, you'll have a hard time dealing damage to them, if at all. Blob is not only one of the weapons in this game that breaks this rule, but it does so in brilliant fashion. One of the properties that lets it do this are its arced projectiles. Blob's shots will always fall back down to the ground in a predictable pathway, which enables you to hit opponents over walls or curved pieces of terrain easily. It also allows you to play around map elevation effectively and creatively, such as being able to easily hit enemies on a ledge above you if you're up below them. Blob's other and more defining gimmick is that its shots bounce twice before despawning, which is where creativity really comes in with this weapon. Shot bounces with this weapon give options to hit opponents behind obstacles from side angles, can help clear areas below you, and can generally create strange off-angle shots that your opponents are not looking for or expecting. Now let's look into the weapon's stats and basic properties, since there's a surprising amount of depth to discuss here. Most immediately, you can see that Bloblobber shoots sets of 4 gravity-prone blobs that each deal 30 damage and can bounce twice. But that's about all the game will tell you directly. First additional thing worth mentioning is that Blob has larger hitboxes than most weapons. While weapons such as shooters and splatlings have a bullet collision radius of 2, Blob's leading shot has a radius of 7.5, and all other trailing blobs have a radius of 5. This disparity between the first blobs and the rest can easily be seen in the training range. However, this general property means that as long as you put your shots near opponents, they are likely to make contact. This is easier said than done though, since Bloblobber also has the slowest shot velocity of any weapon in the entire game. Because of this, Blob has to shoot where you think your opponents are going to be, rather than where they currently are, at least in most cases. This isn't always a bad thing though. Since Blob's shots are both large and slowly moving, they are perfect for locking down an area and being a lingering, persistent threat. Just a couple shots in a direction can pressure opponents in that space for up to several seconds because they move so slow and bounce around so much, which is what makes Blob such a great weapon for area control and denial. I'll go into that more later on. Also, one fun fact about both Bloblobber and every other slosher in this game is that their shots move ever so slightly slower when fired in the air compared to when fired on the ground. This is to prevent sloshers from gaining more range in the air given how their shots move and fall. This isn't really relevant in most cases, but just a fun thing to know. The last basic property of Blob is how the shots are affected by gravity. As mentioned before, Blob's fall-off trajectory is consistent and predictable for the user, which gives rise to its slosher class shenanigans. The effects of gravity and elevation do not only affect the initial shot from the weapon, but also the bounces. This means that the effective range of Blob can change greatly depending on map terrain. For example, firing uphill on a ramp keeps the shots from going very far at all, but when firing downhill it can easily outrange even chargers. And in the cases of extreme elevation changes such as Moray Towers, the weapon's range can be outright broken sometimes. Blob's arced and bouncing shots can also be used creatively, and one of my favorite ways to do this is to layer sets of blobs on top of each other to really flood out an area. This can be done vertically by firing one set of blobs upwards and then another one straight forward, or it can be done horizontally by shooting against a wall and then turning around. Like how I discussed suction bombs in my aerospray video, this can also be used to layer bullets on top of objects like the Rainmaker shield to deal huge damage to it immediately. One final niche yet strong use of this mechanic is to shoot straight up before peeking around a wall to layer shots on top of yourself, which keeps your feet painted and makes it hard for opponents to move past you while you're doing this. Now it's time to really dive into the specifics of how the weapon works for some wild yet valuable tricks. As a member of the slosher class, Bloblobber gets to do something called flick sloshing. Sloshers that fire more than one bullet at once have a mechanic where the movement of your camera at the time of firing your first shot will set the spacing and angle of each projectile after that, regardless of where you aim, for the duration of that shot. For Bloblobber, flick sloshes let you spread out blobs from one burst to cover more area. While the spread makes it much harder to land all 4 blobs in one hit to secure a quick kill, it greatly increases the weapon's paint output and makes it more likely to land 1 or 2 rogue hits onto opponents, which is great for cleaning up enemies that are already damaged. The mechanics of flick sloshing can also be used in a strangely opposite way. When firing with Blob while strafing normally, Usually your shots become spread out by default, resulting in similar effects as a flick slash would. However, if you flick slash in the opposite direction as your strafe, you can actually layer your blobs together in one dense burst once again, enabling you to land one-shot kills while also being highly mobile. This definitely takes a lot of time to master, but is well worth the effort, especially if you play Blob a lot more aggressively. Another funny quality of Bloblobber is that once a shot is started, all 4 blobs are guaranteed to spawn, even if you die while doing that shot. This gives Blob the absolutely stupid ability to kill opponents from the grave. This can look like extreme lag to an outsider, but it's a genuine intentional feature in the game, for some reason. The remainder of mechanic-based tricks I'll be talking about are centered around another feature of Bloblobber, which is that shots generated in one burst from Blob are all spawned from one predetermined origin point at which the shot began. This origin point cannot move vertically, but it can and will move horizontally with the player's movement. The lack of vertical movement is apparent when using the weapon on top of bounce pads, and the horizontal movement is extremely obvious when you shoot while landing from a super jump. This property can be abused in a number of ways. One such way is with ledge peeking, where you barely poke your head over a ledge or wall when you start shooting, then let gravity pull you back down to cover. Since the origin point of the shot cannot move down with you, blobs continue to be fired from the height of the ledge despite you no longer being there yourself. This mechanic can also be used to affect the spacing of your blobs and thus your kill time. If you move backwards from an opponent while shooting, the blobs will become more spaced out, increasing your time to kill. In the same way, moving forward will group your blobs on top of each other, making you kill in one burst even faster. Moving forward especially can be used in fights to melt opponents fast before they have a chance to finish you off. Lastly, moving Blob's shot origin point forward can actually phase it through objects that are thin enough, such as splash walls and umbrella shields, letting you outright shoot through them. The applications of this in proper matches is extremely limited, but it's simply too silly not to mention. This weapon's already so good at shooting over or around things, but the fact that it can straight up shoot through some objects is just so stupid. As you can see, there's a whole lot going on with Bloblobber as a main weapon, but as we know, weapons of this game also come with a sub and special weapon, and thankfully both of Blob's kits provide it with additional tools to either abuse its strengths or cover for its weaknesses. To start off, Vanilla Blob has Splash Wall as its sub, which on its own is useful in helping Blob control space and keep itself from getting overwhelmed easily. Although Blob does have the potential to kill opponents quickly up close, it is generally more comfortable for it to fight from a mid-range distance and have enough time to set up shots. And the survivability Wall gives it helps a ton with that. By the way, the elements of Bloblobber's kits are not without their own tech as well. Even Splash Wall has tricks to deploy it in useful and creative ways, such as bouncing it off of terrain to get more favorable positioning and angles when peeking around corners. Walls can also be placed over gaps or on ledges above you in some cases, which can give you extra cover when going for aggressive shot angles. I made a whole video a while back showcasing a bunch of useful locations for this, which will be linked below. For its special, Blob has Ink Storm, which adds to the weapon's chaotic nature and ability to scatter paint and chip damage all around the map. A well-timed and positioned Storm can also funnel enemies from behind areas that are hard for you to reach normally, bringing them right where you want them for easy cleanup. Areas on some maps happen to line themselves up perfectly to be flushed out by ink storms and are useful to keep in mind. One of my favorites of these being across the length of Snipe on Muscle Forge Fitness, but there are many more out there. If you happen to like using Bloblobber or any other storm weapon on Manta Maria, Inkstorm has a unique trick there too, where hitting the storm spawner on the floor under the map will deploy the cloud at the perfect height to block the camera of players standing on mid-grades when they try looking down, while still letting players underneath them see them from below, making this particular storm lineup great for pressuring annoying chargers or splatling players who position themselves up there often. Blob's other kit is Bloblobber Deco, which comes with Sprinkler as a sub. Sprinkler may seem somewhat redundant for this weapon at first, since it can already spread high amounts of paint easily with the main weapon. However, Sprinkler's utility for Blob doesn't come in from shots it puts out necessarily, but from the Sprinkler itself. When it contacts a surface, Sprinkler puts a considerable amount of paint under itself, which can come in clutch when trying to move around the map quickly, especially when going up walls. Sprinkler's hitbox can also be used as a pseudo splash wall sometimes, as it can tank a shot or two for you before breaking. The immediate paint output and tanking capability of Sprinkler combined can make it a surprisingly valuable tool in up-close fights, since if you throw it directly in front of an enemy, it can slow their movement and absorb some damage for you, giving you time to fire off an easy shot for a kill. Blob Deco's special, Suction Bomb Launcher, is easily one of the best specials for painting and area control in the entire game, which when given a relatively cheap 190p special cost and paired to the main weapon with similar strengths, creates one of the game's greatest painting control fiends. Blob Deco has no difficulty getting a high special count, and by extension can paint counts well above 2,000 points. It's a perfect kit combination to enable you to stay alive while still keeping drastic influence over the map, which is especially strong in modes like Splat Zones and Turf War. Now I've mentioned several times how Blob is a good weapon for area control through both paint output and damage output. But what exactly does this mean, and why is it so valuable? Area control, simply put, is what it sounds like, holding control over a space for your team while denying the opposing team access to that space. In Splatoon, the most direct way of holding an area is by having it covered in your team's ink. While you hold map control, you and your team can move through that area quickly by swimming and can be sure enemies are not in that area you have painted, letting you focus your attention forward on limiting the remaining space your opponents have control over. Since Splatoon is rather unique as a shooter for having generally low weapon range, area control can also let you feel safe in a space despite being somewhat open when you have decent distance between you and enemy turf. To effectively take back map control in most cases, the other team has to get close and enter that space physically, leaving them vulnerable. These game fundamentals are something Bloblobber can both effectively set up for and exploit through its weapon design. The weapon's immense and flexible reach through angles and shot bounces allows it to paint and deal damage at long ranges and around terrain while staying relatively safe, gaining map control for minimal risk. Blob's decent fire rate and ink efficiency make it easily spammable as well, letting it be persistent and assertive in its takeover of an area. And since its blobs will always deal 30 damage regardless of how far they've traveled, those slow moving and large hitboxes always have to be respected, since they can pick up kills even after being active on the map for a long time. While taking or maintaining map control, a key element involved in good decision making is information. That being knowledge of where the opponents are and what they're doing. Once again, paint control is a good source of information, since enemies will almost always be in their ink and will not be in your own. Whether an enemy takes damage or stands in your team's color, they will appear on your map, and as a weapon that's very capable of throwing out random hitboxes and patches of paint, Blob is great at gaining information on enemy locations directly or indirectly. Sending volleys of blobs deep into enemy control or around walls that your team is not secured can either give direct feedback on enemy locations if you damage or paint under them, or could give hints at where they are if you do not find anyone. In a way, a lack of feedback is still information since it tells you where your opponents are not located, meaning they must be somewhere else. This aspect of Bloblobber is why you might see some blob players using thermal ink. Making contact on an enemy with just a single blob will make them show up on your screen through walls for up to 16 seconds, making keeping track of them even easier. Although experienced players can get enough information to work with just by checking their map regularly, thermal ink can still be valuable and can act as training wheels of sorts for getting these concepts down. All in all, pairing these overall strengths of Bloblobber with tech like flick sloshes and the weapon's kits makes it clear how dominant it can be in both taking and maintaining map control when in experienced hands. Although Blob can get plenty of value just by firing shots in relevant directions, the weapon truly becomes fun when you start learning consistent, powerful shot angles. A good angle will reach and pressure an important spot where opponents are likely to be or will want to be, keeping them away and allowing you or the rest of your team to take area control while the opponent repositions. Strong angles always involve bouncing shots off of some wall to hit an area behind cover. It can be done from a consistent location where you are not vulnerable to the position you are trying to deny or take. In some instances, you can also find particular things to aim at to make lining up your favorite angles easy and quick in the heat of a match. For example, when standing under the box on Plat on Inkblot Art Academy, shooting at the rightmost icon on the wall sticker conveniently lines up an angle to hit right behind that box. There are countless angles to be found, with many existing for the same locations even, and the fun really comes from going out there and finding some on your own. After all, nothing is more satisfying than reading your opponent's positioning and movement and perfectly nailing them with a premeditated angle. In order to best utilize Bloblobber's gimmicks, it's usually best to position yourself in narrow or closed off areas of the map with some type of map geometry to play around. While Blob's ability to lock down a particular space is incredible, its slow shot velocity and decent end lag makes it hard for Blob to react to flanks or off angles, making positioning in the open risky. If you get flanked by multiple angles at once, you'll have to hope for a miracle to get out of there alive. Therefore, Blob often likes to play on the sides of the map where your back as well as one or more sides of you are protected by walls or the void, meaning you can focus all of your attention forward, taking space while denying enemies any chance to push into you. This is especially true for Vanilla Blob, whose Splash Wall and Storm excel in cramped spaces where opponents cannot move around them. Sometimes Blob Deco can position in open spaces like mid to gain influence over as much area as possible and flex his painting power, but you'll always want to have a retreat option to some kind of cover available in case enemies start closing too much distance. To end things off, I want to briefly detail how all of this information can be put into practice via the two main approaches or playstyles for Bloblobber. The first and more natural playstyle is a passive one, where you maintain persistent and safe control over key locations, such as the zone and splat zones. This style tries to avoid risky plays and fights, instead maximizing paint output and area denial as much as possible. Although you may not move around the map too often while playing like this, You might change where you're looking and shooting quite often as opponents try to enter your area of control from different angles and directions, while you either continue walling them out or punish them for challenging your position. Bloblobber Deco is the kit most fit for this role, as its unrivaled range of influence and paint output gives it plenty to do despite being rather stationary. Gear abilities like Inksaver Main, Special Charge Up, Main Power Up, and Last Ditch Effort help Blob Deco spam paint and specials even harder than it already can, and are a great fit for the style. The other approach to Blob, and my favorite out of the two, is an aggressive style. While strong area control is typically associated with patient and methodical play, Blob has enough kill pressure and mobility to get away with taking a position on the front lines when you're experienced enough, letting you force your area of control forward into the enemy. Rather than waiting for your opponents to slip up when challenging you and punishing them for it like a passive Bloblobber does, an aggressive Blob strikes first, using its obscene angles and poking power to find kills on opponents in defensive positions who expect to be safe there, or at the very least pressuring them enough to force them away from where they want to be. This playstyle could be a real thorn in the side of your opponents, disrupting their normal and comfortable positions and approach options for retaking the map. Even if you don't get many kills yourself, an aggressive Bloblobber can still funnel enemies away from itself and into the loving arms of your teammates, who await their panicked relocation for easy kills of their own. Vanilla Blob is a better suit for this style, since Splash Wall gives you survivability in the up-close engagements that you're far more likely to encounter, and Inkstorm helps to funnel and chip away at enemies aggressively alongside the main weapon. Abilities like Swim Speed Up, Quick Respawn, Stealth Jump, and Object Shredder are great starting points for a playstyle like this, letting you move around the map quickly, minimize your downtime between respawns, or help you take down defensive subs and specials that your opponent might use to stall your approach. Alright, I know that was a lot, but I'm finally done. To me, the depth, flexibility, and creativity to this weapon are all what makes it so fascinating. Despite having thousands of games with Bloblobber under my belt, it still feels like I find something new with it every day, so using it never gets old. I tried to include a combination of baseline explanations of game fundamentals alongside more specific tricks and tips, so hopefully there was something to be learned from this regardless of your experience with the game. By the way, if you're looking to connect with any Blob players out there, I'll leave a link to the Bloblobber Propaganda Twitter account below, which promotes streams and clips from Blob players and even has an associated Discord server for Blob enjoyers of all skill levels. Anyway, that's all from me, so thank you for watching and have a good one.